Naomi sat on the cold floor of what used to be her home, holding her daughter Betty close. It had been days since her husband Martin passed away. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt empty, filled only with the weight of grief. Her hair had been shaved as part of the mourning ritual, and with every passing moment she felt her world falling apart. The morning after the funeral, Emmanuel, Martin's younger brother, knocked on the door. His face was stern, his voice colder than usual. "You know the tradition, Naomi," he started. "Now that Martin is gone, it's my responsibility to take care of you and Betty. You must marry me." Naomi's heart sank. Marry Emmanuel? She had never liked him. Martin had been kind, loving and patient, while Emmanuel was selfish, proud and quick to anger. The thought of being his wife made her stomach turn. She stood up, holding Betty's hand tightly. "I can't do it, Emmanuel. I can't marry you." His eyes darkened. "Then you have no place here." Naomi felt a cold fear grip her chest. "But this is Martin's house. This is where Betty was born. I have nowhere to go." Emmanuel shrugged. "You have no son. Without a son, you have no claim to this house or anything in it. Everything belongs to me now." Naomi knelt before him, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Emmanuel, let us stay, even if it's just in the kitchen. I beg you. We have nowhere else. I am an orphan, and Betty is so young." But Emmanuel turned away, his voice firm and unfeeling. "As long as you refuse to marry me, you're not welcome here. Leave, or I'll have you thrown out." Naomi's heart shattered as she clutched Betty close to her chest. She had lost her husband, and now she was losing her home. With no other choice, she gathered what few belongings she could carry and stepped out into the cold, uncertain night. They wandered aimlessly, the streets silent and unforgiving. Betty's soft voice broke through the silence. "Mama, where are we going? Are we going back home soon?" Naomi swallowed her tears, forcing a small smile for her daughter. "We're going to find a new home, my love, somewhere safe." But deep down, Naomi didn't know where they would go or what they would do. All she knew was that she couldn't give up. For Betty's sake, she had to keep moving forward. They slept on a bench that night, Betty curled up in her mother's arms. Naomi stayed awake, watching the stars and wondering how her life had come to this. Every moment was a reminder of how unfair life had become. Her mind raced with fear and uncertainty, but she knew she had to be strong for her daughter. Days passed, and Naomi found herself knocking on doors, asking for work, but no one seemed to have any to offer. Some turned her away with pity in their eyes, others with harsh words. Naomi walked through the streets, holding Betty's small hand tightly. Her feet ached, and her heart felt even heavier. They had been walking for hours, searching for shelter, but every door they knocked on had turned them away. The cold wind bit at their skin, and Betty's tired voice broke the silence. "Mama, I'm hungry." Naomi stopped, kneeling in front of her daughter. She brushed a strand of hair from Betty's face, trying to smile even though her own stomach was empty. "I know, my love. We'll find something soon." As they continued down the road, a man named John noticed them. He had seen the look of defeat on Naomi's face, the way her steps were slow and heavy. Her shaved head told a story he had seen before. Grief and loss, a widow with no place to go. Betty's weary eyes tugged at his heart as she walked beside her mother, too tired to even ask for more. John approached them, his eyes full of concern, as he matched their pace. He could tell they had been walking for hours, maybe even days. Naomi didn't even notice him at first, her mind too wrapped in worry and exhaustion. It wasn't until she felt someone near that she turned her head slightly, her body stiff with fear. Seeing the kind look on John's face, Naomi hesitated. She had learned not to trust easily, but she had no choice now. John saw the uncertainty in her eyes, but offered no threat, only a gentle presence. With a quiet gesture, John led them to his home. It wasn't far, just a few streets away. The house wasn't big, but it was warm and safe. The door opened to a modest living room where a fire flickered in the corner, casting a soft glow on the walls. Naomi and Betty stepped inside, feeling the warmth on their cold skin. Betty's eyes widened as she looked around, a small spark of hope lighting up her tired face. Naomi, still unsure, stood silently, taking in the kindness of the moment. John motioned toward the table where a simple meal waited, bread, soup, and fresh water. Without a word, Betty sat down, her hunger too strong to ignore. Naomi watched her daughter eat, relief flooding her heart for the first time in days. John disappeared for a moment, leaving Naomi and Betty alone in the quiet room. Naomi sat down, her legs finally giving way to the exhaustion she had been fighting. She looked at her daughter, who was now smiling faintly between bites of food, and her eyes welled with tears. After a while, John returned with a blanket and a pillow, offering them a place to rest. Naomi hesitated, unsure how long they could stay, or what the future held, but for now they had shelter. For now, Betty was safe. The next morning, Naomi woke up to the smell of fresh bread and the warmth of the sun streaming through the window. She felt rested for the first time in a long while, grateful for John's kindness. As she sat down to breakfast, Betty still half asleep beside her, John spoke in a voice that surprised her. He told her that he had already fallen in love with her, that from the moment he saw her and Betty on the street, he knew he wanted them to stay with him forever. Naomi was stunned. She didn't expect this. Her heart raced, unsure of what to say. She barely knew him, and the idea of love felt foreign, especially after just losing Martin. Though she didn't love John, his offer felt like the only safety she had. She was an orphan with nowhere else to go. After everything Emmanuel had done, after being cast out of her own home, this felt like her only option. Reluctantly, Naomi agreed. She had to think of Betty, of their future, and with John offering stability, it seemed like the best choice. Though hesitant, she moved into the rhythm of life with John. They became a couple, and at first everything seemed fine. John treated Betty well, and Naomi started to believe that maybe she could build something new here, even if her heart wasn't fully in it. But soon, whispers reached her ears. People in the neighborhood started talking, saying they had seen John out late at night, at bars and hotels with other women. At first, Naomi refused to believe it. John was kind to her, and he had promised to take care of them. She couldn't imagine that he would betray her trust. Then, the signs became harder to ignore. John would come home late, smelling of alcohol. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at all, and when Naomi asked where he had been, his excuses felt thin, like he was hiding something. The uneasy feeling in her chest grew stronger, but Naomi still didn't want to believe the worst. She had started to care for John, and the thought of him betraying her was too painful to accept. One night, John didn't come home until dawn. Naomi confronted him, her heart pounding in her chest. She asked him where he had been, and though John tried to deny everything at first, his eyes betrayed him. He begged her for forgiveness, swearing that it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. He promised that he loved her, and that she was all he needed. By then, Naomi had fallen in love with John. She didn't want to lose him. She had seen the good in him, the man who had rescued her and Betty from the streets. She wanted to believe that he could change, that the cheating was just a moment of weakness. So, with tears in her eyes, Naomi forgave him. Life carried on, though the weight of John's betrayal hung over Naomi like a dark cloud. She tried to push it aside, focusing on her business. She had started selling goods at the market, leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night. The business kept her busy, and it was growing steadily. She finally had something of her own, something that made her feel like she was contributing to their life together. But while Naomi worked hard at the market, John stayed home. He had lost his job and didn't seem interested in finding another one. Instead, he spent his days at home with Betty. At first, Naomi didn't think much of it. Betty was old enough to look after herself, and John was still kind to her. But as the weeks passed, Naomi began to notice changes in Betty. Her daughter, once so full of energy and joy, seemed withdrawn, quieter than usual. Naomi asked Betty if everything was all right, but her daughter would just nod and give short answers. Naomi chalked it up to the changes in their life, the loss of her father, moving in with John, the new routine. But deep down, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Naomi didn't know the terrible secret hiding in her own home. While she worked long hours at the market, John, the man she thought had saved them, was hurting her daughter in ways she couldn't imagine. He had warned Betty to keep quiet, threatening both their lives if she dared tell anyone. Betty was only 13 and terrified, so she stayed silent, suffering in fear every day. Each morning, as Naomi left for the market, Betty dreaded the sound of the door closing. That was when John's dark side would come out. Betty would shrink into herself, trying to disappear, but John was always there, lurking. He told her she couldn't tell anyone, especially not her mother, or terrible things would happen. Betty lived in constant fear. She barely spoke, her heart heavy with the weight of her secret. She loved her mother deeply and couldn't bear the thought of Naomi getting hurt. John had made sure Betty felt powerless, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. As the days passed, the fear gnawed at her, but so did her anger. One day, Betty mustered the courage to ask John why he was doing this to her. Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with confusion and pain. John responded without hesitation. He told her that her mother, Naomi, was always away at the market, working long hours. When he wanted to be with Naomi, she would push him away, saying she was too tired. He told Betty that he didn't want to cheat on her mother anymore, that he had given up his bad habits. But since Naomi wasn't giving him what he wanted, he turned to Betty. Hearing this twisted explanation made Betty feel sick. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She hated him more with every word. John tried to make it seem like this was somehow normal, as if it was acceptable because he had chosen her over cheating with other women. Betty's heart filled with disgust, and the sight of him began to fill her with even more hatred. But she was still afraid. John's threats echoed in her mind, and she couldn't bring herself to tell Naomi. She knew her mother loved John, trusted him. How could she break that trust with such terrible news? And what if John followed through on his threats? Naomi noticed changes in Betty, but didn't know what was really going on. Betty had become distant, withdrawn. She no longer smiled or laughed the way she used to, but when Naomi asked her if something was wrong, Betty would just shake her head and say she was fine. Naomi assumed her daughter was still adjusting to their new life after everything they had been through. Betty had been waiting for the right moment to talk to her mother. She had been thinking about school a lot lately. All her friends were going, learning, dreaming about their futures, and yet here she was, stuck at home with John. Now that Naomi was earning more from her business, Betty believed there was a chance for her to go back to school and live a normal life, away from the nightmare she was trapped in. One evening, after Naomi came back from the market, Betty gathered all her courage and spoke up. She asked her mother if she could finally be enrolled in school now that Naomi was making more money. Betty's voice was filled with hope, longing for a way out of her miserable situation. She wanted to escape, to have something that gave her purpose and took her away from the darkness in their home. But Naomi shook her head. Her voice was tired as she explained that the money she earned wasn't enough. She was already stretched thin, and now that John was jobless, she was the one taking care of everything, including his aging parents. Betty felt her heart sink. How could this be? How could her mother choose to take care of John's family while she was being left behind? Betty stared at her mother in disbelief. Shock and frustration bubbled up inside her. She could no longer hold back her feelings. "Mother, why don't you leave this man?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. "Why are we still here, suffering? You're taking care of him and his family, and for what? He doesn't even contribute. He's out there drinking and making a fool of himself every day. He's useless. I don't like him." Naomi's face hardened. She was not used to Betty speaking to her like this, and the frustration of the day, combined with the stress of her life, boiled over. Without thinking, she slapped Betty across the face. The sound echoed in the room, leaving a painful silence in its wake. Betty's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Tears welled up instantly, and she ran to her room, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe her mother had hit her. The slap wasn't just painful, it was a sign of everything that was wrong in their lives. How could her mother defend John, the man who was destroying them? How could she put him before her own daughter? That night, Betty lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling as tears streamed down her face. She wished more than anything that God would take her away from this world. She felt so alone, trapped in a life filled with pain and suffering. She couldn't bear it anymore. John had taken everything from her, and now it felt like her mother was slipping away too. Betty's mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why did her mother stay? Why didn't she see how much they were suffering? Wasn't she enough for her mother? Wasn't her happiness and future more important than taking care of John's family? The pain in her chest grew heavier as she thought about all the missed opportunities, all the dreams that were slipping away. She thought about the other kids her age, how they were in school, playing, learning, growing, and moving forward with their lives. But here she was, stuck, with no way out. The thought of facing another day in this house, with John and the secrets she carried, felt unbearable. Betty whispered a prayer, her voice cracking as she begged for something to change, for an escape from the misery that had taken over her life. All she wanted was peace, a chance to be happy, to live without fear, and to be free from the nightmare that had consumed her. The next morning, as soon as Naomi left for the market, Betty was alone in the house with John. He had been waiting, and his expression was dark as he stormed into the living room where Betty sat, trembling. Without warning, John grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and cruel. He told her he had heard everything she said to her mother the night before. His voice was cold and full of menace, and he reminded her of his threat. He said that if she ever dared to speak against him again, he would make sure to carry out his promise to hurt both her and Naomi. Betty's heart raced with fear. She could feel the threat hanging in the air like a heavy weight. But John wasn't finished. His anger took over, and he lashed out, doing unspeakable things to her once again. Betty felt helpless, trapped in her nightmare, powerless to stop him. When he was done, John left her there, broken and terrified, as if what he had done meant nothing. He left the house, heading straight to the local bar. John didn't care about anything anymore, not even hiding his behavior. He had stolen money from Naomi's savings that morning and was now using it to buy drinks, laughing and spending the day in the company of other drunkards, while Betty remained at home, dealing with the pain of what had just happened. Betty sat alone in the living room, her body aching and her heart shattered. She felt empty, as if she had no strength left to face the day. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, their nosy neighbor Angelica showed up at the door. Angelica had a reputation for sticking her nose into other people's business. She was always watching and listening, eager to hear about the troubles of others. Normally, Betty would have tried to avoid her, but today she didn't have the energy. Angelica came in, her eyes sharp as she scanned Betty's face. She immediately sensed something was wrong. She asked Betty what the problem was, her tone persistent. Betty was terrified to tell the truth, afraid of what John might do if he found out she had spoken about him. So she only mentioned the slap her mother had given her the night before and how Naomi had refused to enroll her in school. Even though she didn't say much, her words stirred something in Angelica. Angelica's face turned red with anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could your mother do that? How could she choose a worthless, jobless man over her own daughter's future? Angelica fumed. Betty tried to calm her down, begging her not to say anything to Naomi, but Angelica wasn't the type to stay silent. She didn't care about keeping peace. She cared about being right. Later that evening, after Naomi returned from the market, Angelica wasted no time in marching over to their house. She was furious, ready to confront Naomi and tell her exactly what she thought. Naomi had barely set down her bags when Angelica burst into the house, her voice sharp and filled with rage. "How can you call yourself a mother?" Angelica's voice echoed through the small living room. "You're letting that useless man, that good-for-nothing John, run your life while your own daughter suffers. You choose him over her education, over her future. You're a disgrace." Naomi was stunned, standing frozen in the middle of the living room as Angelica's harsh words hit her like stones. Angelica was relentless, her voice rising with every accusation. She called Naomi all sorts of names, accusing her of being a useless mother who was blind to the damage John was doing. Angelica didn't hold back, bringing up the fact that Naomi was taking care of John and his parents while her own daughter was being neglected, denied an education, and left to suffer. Betty stood silently in the corner, her eyes wide and her heart racing as Angelica unleashed her fury. She had begged Angelica not to confront her mother, but now it was too late. Angelica had stirred up everything, and Betty could feel the tension in the room rising with each word. Naomi's face turned red, her hands clenched into fists, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, listening to Angelica's insults, feeling the weight of her anger. When Angelica finally left, the door slammed shut behind her, and the house fell into an uneasy silence. Naomi turned slowly toward Betty, her eyes dark with rage. Without warning, she rushed at Betty, her voice shaking with anger. "You told her, didn't you? You went behind my back and told her everything." Naomi's voice was like thunder, her anger boiling over. Before Betty could say a word, Naomi's hand struck her across the face, the slap harder than before. Betty staggered back, her cheek burning from the impact, tears already welling up in her eyes. But Naomi wasn't finished. In her rage, she grabbed Betty by the arm and began beating her, unleashing all of her frustration and anger on her daughter. Betty tried to shield herself, but Naomi's blows kept coming, fueled by the hurt and humiliation she felt from Angelica's harsh words. When Naomi finally stopped, out of breath and shaking, Betty lay on the floor, crying quietly. Her body ached, and her heart felt heavy with sorrow. She couldn't understand why her mother, the one person who was supposed to protect her, was hurting her so much. Naomi stood over her, still seething, as if Betty were the cause of all her problems. "Don't think you're getting any food tonight," Naomi spat, her voice cold and distant. "You want to talk behind my back? You can go hungry. Maybe then you'll learn your place." With that, Naomi stormed out of the room, leaving Betty alone on the floor. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the pain in her heart. She had hoped things would get better, that somehow her mother would see the truth about John, but now everything seemed worse than ever. Betty's stomach growled, but she knew she wouldn't be getting any food that night. The hunger was just another punishment in a house that no longer felt like a home. Betty cried softly into the silence, feeling more trapped than ever. She didn't know how much longer she could endure this. She thought about the time before John came into their lives, when things were different, when her mother had been someone she could rely on. Now it felt like Naomi was slipping further and further away, consumed by her attachment to John and blind to the suffering happening right in front of her. As the hours passed, Betty lay awake in the dark, her body aching, her stomach empty, and her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She couldn't keep living like this, but she didn't know how to break free. Every time she tried to speak up, she was silenced, either by John's threats or by her mother's anger. Betty prayed silently, wishing for a miracle, for something, anything, to change. After what felt like hours of lying in pain, Betty slowly picked herself up off the floor, her body sore from the beating Naomi had given her. She was too afraid to go near the kitchen for food, knowing her mother had forbidden it. The house felt colder and more suffocating than ever before. Betty had never felt so alone in her life. She missed the days when her mother had been loving, when they had shared laughter and comfort, but those days seemed like a distant memory now. Later that night, when Naomi finally returned to the living room, her anger had not cooled. She stared at Betty with a coldness in her eyes that frightened her. Naomi's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "I've had enough of you," Naomi spat, her voice filled with bitterness. "You think you can talk back to me, that you can disrespect me in my own home. If you don't like it here, then leave. Get out." Betty's heart stopped. She had never expected her mother to go this far. She blinked, trying to process what was happening, but the pain in Naomi's words was clear. Naomi grabbed Betty's arm and practically dragged her toward the door. Before Betty could even say a word, Naomi pushed her outside, shutting the door behind her with a harsh bang. Betty stood there, shocked and shivering in the cool night air, staring at the closed door. She had nowhere to go. No family, no friends. The only person she could think of was Angelica, the same neighbor who had confronted Naomi earlier that day. With heavy steps and tears streaming down her face, Betty began walking toward Angelica's house. It wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. She felt lost, broken, and utterly alone. Her mother had thrown her out, choosing John and his family over her. Betty's mind raced as she knocked on Angelica's door, hoping she hadn't made a mistake coming here. When Angelica opened the door, her sharp eyes softened the moment she saw Betty standing there, her face swollen from tears and her body hunched in defeat. Without hesitation, Angelica pulled Betty inside and wrapped her arms around her. Angelica, who had no children of her own, gently led Betty to the couch and sat beside her, listening as Betty sobbed, the weight of everything finally coming out. Betty told her about the slap, the beating, and how Naomi had thrown her out of the house. She didn't mention John's abuse. She couldn't bring herself to, not yet. But Angelica knew enough to understand that things were terribly wrong. Angelica's heart broke for Betty. She had always known something was off in that household, but she hadn't realized it was this bad. She looked at Betty, her heart swelling with both anger and compassion. "You don't have to go back there," Angelica said softly, brushing the tears from Betty's face. "You'll stay here with me. I don't have much, but I'll take care of you, child. No one should treat you the way your mother has. You're safe here." Betty couldn't believe what she was hearing. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was offering her kindness without expecting anything in return. Angelica had always been a bit nosy, but now Betty saw the caring side of her that she had never really noticed before. Betty nodded through her tears, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Angelica had no husband or children, and she had always longed for someone to care for. In Betty, she saw a young girl in desperate need of love and protection. That night, Angelica made up a bed for Betty in the spare room and prepared a warm meal for her. It wasn't much, but to Betty it felt like a blessing. For the first time in a long time, Betty felt safe. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the comforting sounds of Angelica moving around the house, Betty felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. She knew that things wouldn't be easy from now on, but at least she had escaped the nightmare that had been her life with John and Naomi. Angelica wasted no time enrolling Betty in school. She knew how much it meant to the young girl to have a chance at education, something Naomi had denied her for so long. Betty was nervous at first, having missed out on so much, but Angelica encouraged her every step of the way. She bought her school supplies, uniforms, and everything Betty needed to succeed. Betty was finally able to focus on something other than the pain of her past, and she threw herself into her studies. As time passed, Angelica's life began to change too. Shortly after enrolling Betty in school, Angelica got a job offer she never expected. It was a well-paying position at a reputable company, and it seemed like everything was falling into place. Angelica smiled to herself, convinced that Betty had brought her good luck. She had never had such fortune before, and now, with Betty by her side, things were looking up. With her new job, Angelica was able to afford more than she ever dreamed of. She rented a beautiful apartment in a better part of town, far away from the neighborhood where Naomi and John still lived. It was a fresh start for both of them. The apartment was bright and full of life, a reflection of the new chapter they were beginning together. Betty couldn't believe how much her life had changed in such a short time. The days of living in fear under John's roof were behind her, and now she had a future to look forward to. After Betty and Angelica moved away, things started getting worse for Naomi. John, who had always been lazy and unreliable, began to show his true colors. Whenever Naomi came home late from the market, tired from working all day, John would accuse her of cheating on him. He would shout at her, saying that she must be with other men because she wasn't home to cook for him. One evening, Naomi came home, and before she could even sit down, John started yelling. His face was red with anger, and he grabbed her by the arm. He hit her, accusing her of being unfaithful, even though she had been working hard to provide for him. Naomi was shocked, but didn't have the strength to fight back. She had chosen this life, and now she was paying the price. John's behavior only got worse. He would take money from Naomi's savings and spend it on women and alcohol. The more he drank, the more violent he became. He would stay out all night, leaving Naomi alone, only to return home drunk and angry. The neighbors saw everything, and soon they started gossiping about Naomi. They called her a foolish woman for choosing a man like John over her own daughter, Betty. She had a good child, and she threw her away for this useless man. One neighbor would whisper to another, "Now look at her, suffering because of him." Naomi heard the gossip, but she didn't know how to respond. Deep down, she knew the neighbors were right. She had chosen John, and now she was stuck with the consequences. But even as John continued to steal from her and treat her poorly, Naomi couldn't bring herself to leave. She felt trapped, just as Betty had once felt under the same roof. Every day, Naomi worked harder, trying to make enough money to keep the household running. But no matter how much she earned, John would find a way to take it and waste it. He would go to the bars, spending Naomi's hard-earned money on drinks and other women. When Naomi confronted him, he would deny it, or worse, hit her again. 6 years passed, and Betty had grown into a bright and confident young woman. She was now in university, studying hard and building a life far away from the pain of her past. She even had a boyfriend who cared deeply for her. Life with Angelica had given her a sense of peace, but the memories of John and the horrors he had put her through still haunted her. One evening, Betty sat down with Angelica, who she now called Mom, and gathered the courage to finally tell her everything. She could no longer keep the terrible secret that had been eating away at her for years. Slowly, she began to recount the dark days when John had forced himself on her, threatening to kill both her and Naomi if she ever told anyone. She explained how terrified she had been and how she had stayed silent to protect herself and her mother. Angelica was shocked beyond words. She had always known John was a terrible man, but hearing the truth about what he had done to Betty filled her with rage. Angelica could barely contain her anger, and as Betty tearfully continued, telling her about the threats, the abuse, and the fear, Angelica's heart broke for her. "You should have told me sooner," Angelica said, her voice trembling with emotion. Betty, still wiping away tears, tried to calm her down. "I just wanted to forget. It's in the past, and I'm free now." But Angelica wasn't ready to forget. She knew she couldn't let John get away with what he had done. Her protective instincts kicked in, and before Betty could stop her, Angelica picked up the phone and called the commissioner of police, a close friend of hers. She told him everything Betty had just revealed, sparing no detail. The commissioner was horrified and immediately sent officers to arrest John. When John was taken to the police station, news spread fast. Naomi, still convinced that John could do no wrong, rushed to his defense. She stormed into the station, demanding to know why her husband had been arrested. Desperate and panicked, Naomi insisted that Betty was lying, that her daughter was trying to destroy their lives out of hatred. But the police weren't convinced. They had already started gathering evidence, and it became clear that Betty's story was the truth. Neighbors who had witnessed John's violent behavior came forward to testify, and soon more facts about John's mistreatment of Betty and others began to surface. Naomi refused to accept any of it. She emptied her savings, spending every penny she had on lawyers, desperate to free John from jail. She visited him every day, clinging to the belief that he was innocent, even as the case against him grew stronger. In court, the judge listened to the testimonies, the evidence, and the horrific details of John's abuse. After a long trial, John was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was finally brought to justice for the suffering he had caused. Naomi was shattered. She had lost everything, her savings, her reputation, and most painfully, her daughter. She had spent years defending a man who had destroyed their family. She had chosen John over Betty, and now she was left with nothing. As Naomi returned home, the reality of her choices began to sink in. The house was cold and empty, filled with the silence of all she had lost. She had sacrificed her daughter's well-being for a man who didn't care for her, and now it was too late to make things right. Meanwhile, Betty and Angelica returned home from the courthouse. Betty felt a sense of closure. She had faced her past, and now, with John in prison, she could truly begin to heal. Angelica wrapped her arms around Betty, whispering softly that everything would be okay. 2 weeks after John was sent to prison, Naomi was still living in the house she once shared with him, clinging to the only thing she had left. She had lost her daughter and spent all her savings defending John, and now she had nothing but the empty house and her grief. Every day she sat in silence, wondering how everything had fallen apart. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Naomi opened it to find a woman she had never seen before standing there. The woman looked confident and angry, and without hesitation, she introduced herself. She revealed something that left Naomi in shock. She was John's wife. Naomi felt the ground slip beneath her feet as the woman explained that while John had been with Naomi, he had another family. He had 5 children with her, and all this time part of the money John had been stealing from Naomi had been going to support them. Naomi's mind reeled. How could John have hidden this from her? How could she have been so blind? The woman stood tall, her face hard with contempt, as she demanded that Naomi leave the house immediately. She claimed the house belonged to her and her children, not to Naomi. But Naomi refused. She had been through too much, sacrificed too much, and despite everything, she wasn't about to leave the only place she had left. But the woman was having none of it. She gave Naomi a cold stare and left, but not before telling her that she would be back to deal with her. The next day, true to her word, the woman returned. This time she wasn't alone. 2 large, intimidating men followed her. Naomi watched in fear as they stepped inside the house. She knew what was coming, but there was nothing she could do to stop it. "You need to leave now," the woman demanded again, this time with the men backing her up. Naomi pleaded with her, trying to explain that everything in the house was hers, that she had bought the furniture, the appliances, even the clothes on John's back. But the woman didn't care. She was determined to take what she believed was hers. Naomi clung to her dignity as long as she could, but the men weren't going to listen. They grabbed her belongings, shoving her clothes into bags, while Naomi watched in helpless silence. The woman stood nearby, arms crossed, looking satisfied with herself. After what felt like hours, the men had finished. Naomi was left standing in the doorway, clutching only a few bags of clothes. They hadn't let her take anything else, not the furniture, not the dishes, not the things she had worked so hard to provide for John and herself. Everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed for, was being taken away from her, and she couldn't stop it. As the men shoved her out the door, Naomi turned back one last time, tears welling up in her eyes. She had given her life to John, had defended him, stood by him, and now she was being thrown out like she didn't matter. The house that had once been hers was no longer home. She was a stranger now, left with nothing but her clothes and the weight of her regrets. With heavy steps, Naomi walked down the street, unsure of where to go or what to do next. The reality of her situation hit her hard. John had destroyed her life, and now, even in prison, he was still taking everything from her. Naomi, desperate and broken, went to Angelica's house to beg for forgiveness. When she arrived, the security guard told her that Angelica and Betty had moved abroad. Angelica had gotten a new job, and they had relocated weeks ago. Naomi stood in shock, realizing she had lost her last chance to make things right with Betty. With nowhere else to go and no one left, Naomi walked away, knowing that she would never see her daughter again. She was left to face the consequences of her choices alone. As for Emmanuel, he wandered down the road, lost in his regrets about how he had treated Naomi and Betty. His mind was full of guilt, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. Suddenly, a speeding car came out of nowhere. Before he could react, it struck him with a violent force. Emmanuel died instantly, his regrets dying with him in that single moment. This story teaches that the choices we make, especially when driven by selfishness or neglect, carry lasting consequences that can never be undone. It reminds us to value those we love, treat them with kindness, and seek forgiveness before it's too late, for regret can weigh heavy when there's no chance to make things right. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to turn on notifications for more inspiring tales. Stay blessed, and thank you for your support.